Author Dharampal, somebody whom I really admire, he was in the early 2000s, he was appointed by the then PM Vajpayee ji as one of the key members of the IHRC, and he launched a book called The British Origin of Cow Slaughter in India in 2002. So a lot of my data and research actually stems from this book, and he was a very renowned person who was known to do very deep research and not just glean off the archives. So he went deep into a lot of British archives and he came up with a lot of startling data, which I've shared in this visually appealing presentation. So the first historical fact that author Dharampalji points out is that Robert Clive opened India's first formal cow slaughter in 1716 Kolkata. He removed the ban on cow slaughter, which had been there off and on even during the Mughal rules. And he employed as a divide and rule policy Indian Muslims as butchers in those slaughterhouses. More dangerously, he seeded the thoughts in the minds of a few Indian Muslims that beef eating was their religious right. So much so that in 1958, well after India had achieved independence, there were a group of Indian Bihar Muslims who filed a petition in Supreme Court, quoting that they would want to include beef as a religious right. Of course, that got shot down. Author Dharampalji says that since about 1860, British and European scholars started a new school of Vedic interpretation to impress on the westernized class in India that the ancient Vedas also advocated, celebrated, and feasted on the flesh of the cow or bullock. But that so it'd be easy to explain and understand that yes, our Vedas were also colonized. And we were made to believe this was part of deriding our culture. And historical fact too, one of the longest running anti-colonial movement was a revolt against the British practice of cow slaughter. Now tell me, in our history lessons, how many of us are told about it? Like when I was doing a history and I was a fairly good history student, I don't remember being told about a 14-year anti-colonial movement against the British practice of cow slaughter. We have talked about 1857, we talked about hordes of many other things, but nowhere does our school history lesson mention this, at least in my generation as a student. In fact, this movement shook the foundations of the British Empire to its core, so much so that the Viceroy, Lord Lansdowne, at that time, he wrote a note to the Queen, to Queen Victoria, saying, I doubt whether, since the mutiny, any movement containing in it the greater amount of potential mischief had engaged the attention of the government of India. So, what I'm trying to say is that these very important chapters of our history are not mentioned in our history books. We are not aware that there has, that there was a big movement against the Britishers for the cow slaughter, which they had launched formally in the country. And historical fact three, prominent Indian Muslims participated in this 14-year-old anti-crime killing movement. You understand how many Indian Muslims know this, that their own ancestors were against the practice of cow slaughter, which had been introduced by the Britishers more as a divide and rule policy. So that is why that need to retell this history, to stress upon these factors. I am going back to the book of Dharampalji, where he says the question of the sacrifice of a cow did not arise, as the land where Islam arose did not have many cows. And these immigrants basically ate more of bread along with flesh of sheep, goat, and on special occasions a camel. And so this information had begun coming out even when we were under the British. There was a newspaper which says Islam did not specifically insist on killing of cows. But all of this information, this awareness is not there in our media. It's not there in our history books. It's not there by our eminent universities, our eminent professors. This book, which was launched in 2002, is not really, I mean, I could not even find it on Amazon when I was trying to buy it. You see, so it was great difficulty. I have found screenshots. So, somewhere there is that's why this narrative of why we need to rewrite history has come about, because for far too long, people say it's because of the change in the regime, which it is not that. This narrative had to come out because for far too long the narrative was moving in one direction for good 40 years into independence. So finally, a time came, like a law of physics, where there would be a counter narrative. So that's why we are doing this speech today. That's why I wrote that article a month ago. So this is a historical fact, right, that author Dharampalji wants to point out, that number of cows slaughtered under the Mughal rule annually was 20,000. And under the British rule, it was 30,000 daily. So do you see the mammoth difference in the numbers here? If this data was to be floated within our composite society, I don't think we would have any need for any identity politics that can come out of whether the cow should be slaughtered or not. And again, going back to author Dharampalji's book, where another Lahore-based Islamic newspaper points out that Hindus were mistaken on holding the Muslim responsible, since it's the Europeans who use beef, and were it not for them, the Mohammedans would not indulge in kind slaughter, right? So this is um, so, like I said, the Queen Victoria, mentioned to other Mohammedans, cow killing is made to protect. It's in fact directed against us, who kill far more cows for our army, etc., than the Mohammedans. So I forgot to mention that when after the Battle of Plassey, when Robert Clive had won the battle, and when Calcutta was taken over, they launched the formal slaughterhouse. They wanted beef to be for their army, basically, and for their civilians. This is 1911 newspaper, The Graphic. So this history of Indian Hindus and Muslim to protect their cow has been there all throughout. So much so that there was a Hindu businessman who sent a proposal to the British, saying that I can import Australian beef, but please stop killing the Hindu cows. So most of our history was written during the British time, and we were their subjects. And when they came into India, they realized that they need to understand this glorious yet composite yet complicated culture, and they translated a lot of our works. And when they came, they saw there was a flourishing network of schools which were operating in this subcontinent. They decided to rewrite our history, and they introduced English as the medium, saying that we need to be made more science oriented, we need to be civilized, and also to create an clerical administrative staff which would help them govern the subcontinent better. So, in that process, they of course stressed more on the history of 1200 AD onwards. That was the time when India was undergoing massive invasions, influence of foreign religions, and they deliberately chose to ignore early medieval and late ancient periods. And very cleverly, they omitted out the resistance which was put by the locals here, because they wanted us to feel that we are meant to be ruled, we are meant to be civilized, and because of which Indians gradually over generations developed a subservient mindset, which extended well into a post independent era, because when they were leaving, they handed over the reins of that colonial mindset to some of our founding fathers and to a class of Western elites uh, who related more with the Western values. And that is how the alienation, so gradually Indians began to become alienated from their culture, almost developing a distaste for it. So why we need to retell Indian history is to reinforce its homegrown cultures, because as I explained, Indians have been alienated from their culture for far too long. And like I mentioned, when author Dharampal mentions that when William Adam, when he came into India, he said that there existed 1 lakh village schools in Bengal and Bihar. So Bengal, I mean the Maha Bengal at that point of time. So in the process, what has happened is Indians have lost their cultural identity, and India has become a hotbed of identity politics, which is what we have been seeing for decades. And there is social unrest. There is a lack of cohesiveness between different sects and different identities. Riots, mob lynching, rumor mongering, and loss of public property, court rulings, counter rulings, these have become the order of the day. This is all because of somewhere there is a loss of our cultural national identity. And in all of this, the India's national identity has fractured too. Rather, it was never allowed to have a solid foundation from the time when India as a modern democracy was born. So much so that JNU VC a couple of years ago wanted a tank on the campus to instill feelings of patriotism amongst its students. And that is why for decades we've had the controversy around whether one should stand for the national anthem in cinema halls. This is all because there is a general lack of national identity, because people are unable to relate to their local homegrown indigenous culture. And then the state tries to use these artificial means to create a sense of cultural and a national identity. And what are the effects of a fractured national identity is there is a lack of sufficient social capital. Social capital, I mean the the sense of working together between various social groups. The best example can be seen now during COVID times, when uh, how well as a society are we listening to the instructions of the government, to the state, how much of our civic sense is there to wear the masks, to interact, so that is social capital, the degree, the extent to which people want to work together as a single unit. So because of a lot of different identities, there is a lack of effective social capital. And in this, identity politics intensifies further because it's a vicious cycle. And not just that, there is loss to the economy which occurs when there is a loss of public sector. A lot of resources which which the government can dedicate to infrastructure. At times, they have to dedicate their paramilitary forces to maintain order in the society. Not just that, there are a lot of a lot of people who are looking at the progress which is being made in the country, and a lot of foreign publications. So they are quick to point out and print and record these episodes of identity politics, which causes an erosion of India's image in the world community. And when of course, when the country as is not together, so it becomes an easy target for inimical and anti-national forces. Okay, so I am talking about how retelling India's history can minimize its identity politics, and I'm taking the example of one such identity politics, which is cow politics. Culturally, Indians, be Hindus or Muslims, have never been beef eaters. Let us find out why. So, as American sociologists, I've picked up a lot of content from there to further substantiate what I'm saying. So they say that climate, topography, and the indigenous economy affect the tradition and behavior in the primitive heritage of modern society. So remember, when the indigenous homegrown culture of a society it has its roots back, eons ago, when the society was far more primitive. And cultural a lot of cultural practices and traditions are actually very scientific, because they are linked to the climate, topography, and the indigenous economy. So coming to the reverence for the cow, climate wise, Indians never had to rely on meat, because we are a warm nation. Unlike the Europeans, we did not need to eat very food to make us feel warm. Topographically, India has the second largest parcel. I'll share that, in the world. So which means very quickly our primitive society settled into agriculture, and they realized that for their survival, for their food, for their agricultural need, they domesticated the cow and found a lot of benefits of doing that. Like I said, survival, these are the factors which are influencing. So survival is a very crucial factor. So somewhere they would have realized that we cow is important for the survival of our agricultural need and even for our familiar need and our dietary needs. So, like I said, India has the second largest arable land. So there was a lot of foliage, there was grass cover, so it was easy. Unlike Saudi Arabia, which is more desert, which did never had too many cows, and that's why I never got into the culinary habit of eating cows. Unlike that, India had enough foliage and fodder to be able to sustain their cow and also sustain themselves on plant-based diet. In fact, versus China too. Like if I go as late as 1994, India is using most of its arable land, and China, even till 1994, is still only using 50%. So that is why China is also a very meat-eating nation versus India. These are all data to prove that how culture affects our culinary habits, because it is linked to our topography, the vegetation, and survival. And somewhere over a period of time, this realization of reverence for the cow would have been realized by our ancestors, and they institutionalized this reverence in the ancient scriptures, in the Vedas. And that is why they say cow is, they call cow the Aganya, one that ought not to be killed, or Ahi, one that must not be slaughtered, Aditi, one that ought not to be cut into pieces. So, when I was doing a Vedic culture course at JNU Sanskrit department, they told me very categorically that Aganya is a term which is specifically used only for the cow in all of the Vedas. So that was the stature which was given to this animal, and for very scientific reasons which I've already talked about. So, but nevertheless, why did a section of Indian Muslim want to break away from this cultural practice of the respect for the cow? Like, admittedly, when the invasions began in a full swing from 1200 AD onwards, and the Mughal Empire had cemented itself, there was cow slaughter happening, but not as a culinary habit. It was more to show who is in the power, who wielded the sword, and who was the stronger. So it was more to denigrate the Hindus, but not as part of a diet. So let's go back to the science of the culture and how cultural practice emerged. They originate as a practice as out of survival, right? Gradually, they get cemented, they get solidified, and they become a tradition. And some traditions turn sacred. And this is what had happened to the practice of reverence for the cow. The ancestors, they realized that down the line, the origin, as the society becomes more self-sufficient and moves away from being on a survival mode, the origin of why the cow needs to be revered may get lost somewhere. So then that's why they make the tradition sound sacred in the books, in the scriptures, so that the practice carries on across generations to come. So this is how but why did the cultural practice of respect for the cow dwindle over time? That is not too much of a rocket science. There was an entry of foreign religions made. We've had a historical trajectory of last 1,000 years, and that is one. Second, as a lot of American social scientists also say, in fact, this quote I picked up from there, that as societies shift from agrarian to industrial and survival is taken for granted, traditional religious beliefs tend to decline. So, uh, so that is another reason why the during the rule, the foreign rules of the sultanates and the Mughals, this practice would have declined. And like I said, more importantly, because to show who is in power and to denigrate a certain sector of the society, and lack of knowledge of why the practice began in the first place. I've already discussed that. And gradually, what happens that some more followers start moving away from the practice. And once there are enough followers, discord sets in between the followers and non-followers. So that is why there was a small camp of people who believe that they want to eat the cow, and majority, the natives, the Hindus, they stuck on, and of course, they wanted to carry on with the practice. And so this discord and this tussle was seen for the first time in medieval India, when Islamic influence led to the cow being slaughtered on a visible scale for the first time in recorded history. So why is this confusion whether India should allow cow slaughter? Why is it there today? Like I mentioned, in 1958, why did Muslims from Bihar need to file a complaint wanting to eat, the beef as a religious right? So, is there a relation between culture and religion? What is the confusion? What is that relation between culture and religion? Is the part two of my presentation. So, I going back to my earlier slide. Here I'm talking about survival. When a primitive society, the primitive heritage of a modern society, to survive, they create these institutions to deal with the problems which exist at that time. Institutions are structures and activities that provide stability, help them resolve those problems. And institutions reward desirable behavior and punish unacceptable one. And religion is one such institution of culture through which culture plays out. It can influence culture through content teachings, through identities, gods, and rites and rituals. And the extent of the influence depends on the society, the degree to which a religion or multiple religions exist, and the importance, the life, the daily life of the society, in how much stress they are placing upon the religion, and degree of religious homogeneity and tolerance for religious diversity. This is data picked up by American from American sociology books. And as some of they say, that what is the relationship between but however, a society appears to select a major religion that fits well with its long tradition, and then attempts to create a government, a polity system to protect its heritage and tradition. So that is the relation between religion and culture. Okay, so first post uh, is one of the publications, not one of my favorite, because I often, a lot of time, I see that my views are not in tandem with what they have published. But this is an article which I found of interest, so I'm using it here. So they have quoted a lot of historians, and they are also saying a new secular paradigm should not be afraid to admit that Hindu and Muslim identities have deep roots. So I also feel that we tend to be very secular, uh, but religion wise, there are two dialectically opposite religious identities. Okay, and I agree with the scholars here, David Lorenzen and Andrew Nicholson, who have written a lot of work saying these identities formed during the Middle Period. These strong religious identities. Culture is such a complicated subject that since the early 1950s there have been 160 definitions. So it's too quickly, the working definition is a set of knowledge structure consisting of system of values, norms, attitudes that are shared by members of a social group and embedded and played out through the institutions and learned from previous generations. Why we're talking about culture is because I'm stressing on the fact that we need to retell our history to enhance our homegrown culture. So we finished with that relationship between culture and religion. Now let's talk about relationship between cultural identity and national identity, right? Because the fact that we have identity politics happening in current day India, and cow politics is one such identity politics, is because our national identity is not matching with our cultural identity. We are at a cultural loss. We are confused about our identity because we are not relating to our homegrown indigenous culture. And that's why we have so many different identities. And that's why there is a fragmentation of the national identity, and that's why the government feels the need that people should stand in cinema halls. The JNU said there has to be a battle tank on its campus. So that's why we are talking about this. What is national identity? It's simply, as the nomenclature suggests, it's a person's identity or a sense of belonging to one state or to one nation. So here I want to talk about a very interesting phase that the world went through in late 19th and 20th centuries, when a lot of nation states, which in common parlance are known as countries, but being a formal social science oriented presentation, I like to use the word nation states. So that period saw the emergence of nation states, and India was one. And many nation states were a political expression of common culture. So this was doable in Europe, if you remember, or Europe, a lot of new nations sprung up. Germany, Italy, they all came up in those, 1800s, like after 18, between 1850 to 1900s. And they came about through a lot of tussle and fight for borders, etc., through a common culture which was seen. So those were small nations, it was easy, and like wherever there was a common cultural cohesiveness, a nation sprung up. However, like a point to be made that there, in few cases, there was some nation states came about because of a forged alliance, even though culturally there were different subgroups operating. So what I'm trying to say is that if a common culture has been a key foundation to many nation states, and if we agree that a nation state requires a strong national identity for effective functioning, then can we say that common culture is a key ingredient for a strong national identity? Is my point that I'm trying to make. So, you know what our elements of our national identity are. It is the national song, the anthem, the bird, uh, and the flower, the animal. But one which is a very powerful one is a common culture. You will notice that countries which have a common culture, like Japan, have very little resonance at the societal level. You know, so so common culture is an important component of, and it's a naturally healthy. It doesn't have to be enforced, right? And why it is more important than all the other ones is because other components like history, political values, national characteristics, and national interests are all derived from common culture, one way or the other. So it is in the best interest of a nation state that common culture should form an important ingredient of its when a time when it was being created. I'll take the example of Pakistan. It was created around the time when a lot of these nation states were being created. Does Pakistan have a common culture? No. It only has a common religion. And they have Baluch, they have Pashtuns, they have Punjabi Muslims. So they all are culturally very different, and that's why we see a lot of dissonance that keeps happening in that particular nation state. So that is the importance, the power that if a nation, power of a national culture for a healthy nation state to function. But you know, this is a very, like the way culture is a very ambiguous, fluid term requiring 160 definitions, and similarly, the concept of a national culture is also very debatable. A lot of sociologists, there are two different camps. They ask that is there something called a national culture? Does it exist? And especially pertaining to a geographically large, complicated society like ours, does India have a national culture? Culture is expressed, like I said, through art, history, daily life, like you understand. And India, we know every few hundred kilometers, uh, there is a change in the language, if not the language, the dialect, food habits, festivals. But remember, the festivals, even though called by different names, occur around the same period because they are all, most of them are rotating, revolving around the sowing and harvesting of crops. But needless to say, how I would call India, it is has been traditionally from ancient time. It has been a composite society, and it's a very debatable topic. We need a lot of historical data. So I want to talk about. So I'll come back to India in 2 minutes. So I'm saying that finding consensus, defining complex subject as culture itself is not easy because uh, culture is fragmented at many levels, like in the case of India, and nationally, because there's a dynamics between national unity, it raises the question of whether the concept of national culture exists or not. So here there are two camps amongst the Indian the sociologists. So they are against, some of them are against. They say that multiple cultures can exist within national boundaries, and same culture can span many nations. Another very prominent Hofstede, Geert Hofstede, says yes. He says that he makes a powerful argument in favor of a national culture. He says nations are social system, therefore can have a national. And national culture does is relatively stable, but does change over time because of entry of foreign influences, because of trade, and it has happened all over the world. So, did ancient in early medieval India have a cohesive culture? So, like I told you, that every few hundred kilometers, there are variations in our daily life, in our social habits, in the kind of dances, celebration of festivals, foliage, etc., and language, right? But let's not forget that ancient Shiva temples are till date being found across the Indian subcontinent. In fact, I think a week ago, there is a news of an ancient Shiva temple having been found in Pakistan. So if the society, if the Indian society was so fragmented culturally, if everybody had their own cultures, then why are Shiva temples being found all over? Why did Kashmir become a high seat of learning of Shaivism, even though you have Shiva temples down south? Why in the Vedas, or why is saffron an important ingredient for conducting yagnas? And saffron is only found in Kashmir, but yagnas being conducted in south, they talk about having saffron as one of the ingredients. So there was some interlinking. Why did Adi Shankaracharya, almost thousand of years ago, in the search for his guru, why did he, when he had found his guru on the banks of Narmada, why did he not just stay there, by the barrier of the Vindhyas? Why did he feel the need to travel such a massive piece of land when transportation means were so primitive? And why did he feel the need to establish four learning centers in four corners of that landmass, which a lot of secularists say, a lot of that India has been composite. And why is Ramayana uh, enacted every year in a different tone with different stories, but why that commonality? So I'm saying that yes, it's a composite culture, but somewhere there was a common, there was a thread, there was an umbrella of a common culture, which is what the Britishers broke, and they changed that historical text to make us believe otherwise. And yes, during from 1200 AD onwards, there was an influence of foreign cultures, foreign religions, and but those religions came in, but they could not bring their culture in, because the culture of this place was so rich that it easily subsumed and absorbed those Semitic religions, but did not take those cultures. And that's why we don't have Arab being spoken in this country. And so that is why the need to rewrite Indian history to tell us that yes, we have had a composite society, but with the umbrella of a very rich uh, culture. And yes, there were Mahapadas, the political kingdoms who were at loggerheads once in a while, but the history lessons do not talk about the marriages which used to happen, the interaction, or the trade interaction, the social interaction that used to happen with between those little political kingdom which was strewn all over. So that is a deliberate attempt to put down the Indian history, which does not which was written by the Britishers. So this was all done to make us ashamed of our culture, make us alienated from it, and and so that we can relate better to Western culture, and which is what also was a legacy which went deep into even in a post-independent India. And here I want to quote a very eminent scholar. She says Hinduism, by all accounts, this is to answer your question that did India have a common culture, and did that common culture try to create a religion central to them? Yes, I think they did. So, which is what she's trying to say. So, Hinduism, by all accounts, is a diverse and decentralized. Decentralized, that's why you have Ramayana being enacted in so many different ways. Even the storyline changes. But the fact cannot be ignored that yes, Ramayana is read and practiced, enacted across that whole subcontinent. And throughout history, has had a sacred geography of rivers and holy site that has connected adherents across the subcontinent. And that explains the widespread travel of Adi Shankaracharya. Does post independence India have a national culture? We definitely have the national identity elements, the flag, flower, anthem, bird, emblem, tree, animal. And yes, we do have, we are still rooted somewhere. There is a large section of the society, not the Western elites who align with the Western values, but very we still have a culture going, and that's how we're able to survive so far, and that's why this counter narrative began happening in 1990s that we need to shuffle, we need to rewrite our history, because somewhere there was a realization that what we were being taught and told was not making sense and was not apt. So yes, this culture which has been there from ancient times, like I told you, this umbrella threads have been continuing in the current day. Only we need to recognize it and give it its due by rewriting our history. And Indian Constitution was an excellent opportunity to restore the realization of that common culture. Right? This was the time when a modern democracy was being born for the first time, and a lot of our founding fathers, like Vallabhbhai Patel, they went to great lengths to solidify. So this was a great opportunity. But coming to the respect for the cow, not so much, of course, for the animal right reason also, but that's outside the scope. Uh, some of our founding fathers, in spite of having made promises in the 30s that once independence is given, there will be a nationwide anti-cow slaughter. The promises were made, but once independence happened and once the constitution was being written, this law was not passed, because somewhere our founding fathers, I would say, Nehruji and Gandhiji, they did not want to appear communal. They wanted to appear very secular. But I think somewhere they confused religion with culture. They forgot that the reverence for cow, it has its roots deeper into the cultural traditions, which goes way back thousands of years ago. So so whatever the realization, they did not pass this particular law, and that is why the confusion persists till date. Imagine back then if such a law had been passed, this problem of cow politics would have been over and done for once. Like like the clean slate, this problem would not have occurred. So cow was only one of the mediums, once again, to dilute the cultural identity of an ancient civilization. It was first done when foreign religions, not foreign cultures, foreign religions made an entry, when the Britishers colonized us, and when the Indian Constitution was written. And if that was an opportunity for us to gather some of our common cultural identity, it was not, and cow could have been one of the medium, it was not done. And that is why cow politics continues till date. So this is this diagram which I want to, so this is assuming this is the national identity of India, or the flag, or the emblem, the song, the flower. This is the cultural identity. So idea is to overlap the two. So more of the national identity should be covered by the cultural identity. So for that, for which means that we need to be proud of a culture. And what is the best bet is to be proud of your own homegrown culture because it has scientific roots. So for a country, for a nation state to effectively function smoothly, this smaller circle of cultural identity has to become bigger and bigger and bigger till it overlaps all of the national identity, and that's when the nation works beautifully, like does Japan. And so Gandhiji did understand that. That's why he said cow protection is the greatest civilizational gift that Hinduism can give. And finally, I want to summarize by saying it is not about the cow. It is about reclaiming our homegrown culture, being proud of it, touting it as school lessons, imbibing it in our daily lives. And that's when India, with a stronger national identity, would be born. All it needs is its homegrown culture back.
Yes, thank you. So, this was really informative, and thank you so much for bringing all of these points forward. Again, using cow slaughter as sort of an example of cultural inclusivity, I just wanted to, bring up a few issues that I've seen because cow slaughter essentially, right from Humayun's time, they had a prohibition on it. It was enforced by Akbar, and I think only around Aurangzeb's time, was it kind of brought back into the fore, and the British exploited it. However, there was, I think, a few cases in which a lot of the Muslim community was, I would say, engulfed by Sufism, and there was a lot of cultural and religious sensitivity around it. But I think the damage to all of that has occurred more post independence than pre independence, right, where there's been a systematic, I would say, institutional onslaught on our culture and westernization, as you correctly put it. So that being said, since a lot of the fail safes, towards the sensitization of around this topic, because Sufism has been routed from India and the subcontinent in essence, how do we go back bringing around this? I wouldn't call it a cultural revolution, but a re-education, in your opinion, because most of the institutions are controlled by individuals spouting a particular narrative that is contrary to what you just mentioned.
Right. So, the Sanskrit department of JNU a couple of years ago has started this 1 year Center of Proficiency Studies, which talks a lot about the philosophies of our ancient scriptures. I was doing one of that courses till the COVID struck, and the fact that we're doing this presentation, the fact that Dharampalji was appointed by Vajpayee ji, made a key member of the IHR, the Historical Research Center, and he launched this book. So all these efforts are happening slowly and gradually. So there is a fair rise in a counter narrative to what the Britishers passed on to us as a legacy. But you have to understand something which has been suppressed for hundreds of years. It needs at least 50 years for it to see visible tangible results. Changes in the school history lessons is already happening, though under it keeps coming under onslaught. Like in 2017, Maharashtra government and UP government, they did bring about changes in the history. The Maharashtra government, I think, dropped the topic of Mughals. So the change is happening. So school lessons is one. Uh, how the central universities, which are government-led universities, what they are teaching, uh, that those changes are already happening. And social media, internet. I'm fairly active on Facebook, and I have this amazing community of very learned set of intellectuals who so there are a lot of Facebook groups which talk about revival of the ancient Sanatan Dharma. So people are beginning to realize that Hinduism is not even the right word. So I feel a little funny even using the word Hinduism. It has to be Sanatan Dharma because Hinduism as a word was given to us as by the Iranians, who said that these are the people who live on this side of the Indus, the river Indus. So there is a revival happening, but it's slow, and it is happening in social groups. It's happening in NGOs. The fact that Sangam Talks is doing this, so I think they must be bringing about a lot of speakers. So there are little movements which are happening, and I have a fair amount of Muslim friends also, and they know and they admit to me that in Islam nowhere is it prescribed that the beef has to be eaten. So that realization is there. Only we have to be a little more. I think the state, the government is maybe, they, we think that the most visible way would be if the government takes a stand. So that's not easy because we are constitutionally a secular country. So, bringing about such big changes requires a lot of dynamics, not just from the government in the state, but from within the civil society. And I think civil society is doing it beautifully using the power of internet. But visible results, I think we are in 2020. By 2050, there should be a solid, good counter narrative to what the Britishers told us. It should happen.
So this is where I'm making a distinction between Indic religions and Abrahamic religion, because in Indic religion, if you look at, there's no religion as such, and that is why when you say Sanatan Dharma, Dharma is not the religion, is equivalent to religion thing. And here, the cow slaughter you took as an example, and I accept that you took an example, but it is true for any animal slaughter. A cow is just a representation, and cow was chosen because it over by the time when Islamic invasion happened, they figured out that this is the most visible, dearest thing. If you slaughter this particular animal, which is available in abundance, Hindus feel very, very hurt and they go mad, probably as compared to maybe some other animal. But if, let's say, if they would have taken some other animal which was also available in abundance, probably Hindus would have felt the same way. And the fact that Krishna is associated very closely with cow and all of that. Culture, in my opinion, yes, it has representations in the modern times. In the olden times, I don't think there was so much representation like an emblem or a flag or some other thing. There used to be at least one kind of representation, and this is where the heterogeneity used to come, because the Shaivites will have Shiva as the thing, and Vaishnavites would have Vishnu as the thing, and so on and so forth. However, I think the culture was more of how people evolved over a period of time, and especially in Indic religion, it was more about nature and nature's manifestations. Whereas for Abrahamic religions, there was nothing like that, and that is why their religion is the definition or the representation or the manifestation is so different than ours. So that's why I said the culture and religion for Indic religions is very enmeshed. I don't think you can just separate them out. That's what I.
No, so you and I are on the same side. We're talking the same thing. You're just probably framing it in a different manner. When it comes to Indic civilization and all that, that's why I talked a lot about culture, and I talked about religion is only one institution that is used to maintain that culture. That this formed as a good 25% of my presentation, and very rarely did I use the word Sanatana Dharma towards the end. And when I was quoting that Harvard scholar about Hinduism, all along I've talked about the power of the culture, the strength of the culture, and how a culture to retain its beliefs, its traditions, which are rooted in science, in topography, climate, and survival. Hindus basically have been, when you talk about hurt, that they used cow, but it could have been any animal which they would have found in abundance, and these foreign invasion they would have cut, and Hindus would have felt bad. Somehow cow has held a far more sacred, because one is, it is inscribed in the Vedas about aganya, that this is one animal that ought not to be cut. But remember, Hindus are primarily vegetarian, have been, and which means they don't like the idea of an animal being cut, be it any a non-cow also. But cow has been given a special status once again, not so much for animal rights. Animal rights are to be given to all animals, but it was given because of a certain fulfillment of a survival need that the cow fulfilled of our ancestors. That is what I meant by the primitive heritage of modern society. Like our culture, by our culture, every culture in any part of the world emerged, years ago, thousands of years ago, because of the problems which were prevalent at that point of time. So that's why I use that term once again and again. And to say hurt animals, I would say that culturally, Indians, if we go as per the Indic civilizational, did not really cut. They did not cut animals and all, but cow was given a special status more for scientific and for more practical reasons. And yes, these national identity elements that you talk about, flag and all, the national identity elements have to be more natural and more more closer to our heart, and that would happen when we relate closer to our nature. So automatically, if I know that, oh, this is the cow is offering so much benefit even in today's date, when the soil has been depleted beyond repair because of excessive use of fertilizer. There are now newer research articles by the agricultural Indian forums which saying that let's use more of the manure to to replenish the soil once again. So what I'm trying to say is that national identity elements have to be emerging from our cultural identity, and what better than cultural elements which are part of our homegrown culture and not being imported or bought from the West, or etc.